Okay.
Oh,
Okay. Well, hello and welcome everybody to the first day of our symposium, Disability and Fairy Tales, Keeping the Magic, Confronting the Stigma. Together with Nicola, who we've already been chatting to a little bit, we'll be hosting the next 2 afternoons of wonderful discussions. So to begin with, I guess we'll introduce ourselves. Nicola, would you like to go first and to just tell us a bit about you?
yes, absolutely. So, my background, I actually started out, fairy tales have been my kind of comfort and sustenance ever since I was a little girl in boarding school. And the Andrew Lang fairy books are kind of, I think they're kind of bred in the bone now. Um, and I did a degree in English literature and then started out as an English teacher and was so rubbish at crowd control that I turned into a speech and language therapist. But my love of storytelling never left me. And what I did in the early 2000s when I discovered storytelling as a kind of profession, um, I started working as a storyteller as well as a lecturer in speech and language therapy, and then left academia to set up a charity called Open Storytellers. I'll put in the chat, which is the first company of learning disabled storytellers in the UK. There is an equivalent in Japan. So disability and fairy tales really come together for me. And my current job is as Professor for Profound and Multiple Learning Disabilities at the Ricks Centre in the University of East London. And I'm particularly concerned and interested in how people with severe disabilities are represented in legends and folk tales and myth, and in finding the kind of complex roots, because they're not just disabled stereotypes. Actually, there are often really empowering messages hidden within the stories. So it was a great delight to discover Beth as a kindred spirit last year. And over to you, Beth.
Thank you, Nicola. So my background is that I'm currently a PhD student, shockingly researching the representation of disability in fairy tales, specifically looking at the way our contemporary feminist fairy tale retellings use or apply disability in the same way as the traditional versions, but to emphasize new morals. So whereas maybe previously they emphasized religious values, now are we using those same tropes but for different moral ends? I'm coming to the end of my PhD, all being well. I'll be submitting in the next few months. But I'm also a children's author, and a lot of my creative writing is inspired by folklore and fairy tales and attempting to present nuanced and rounded depictions of disability. So my debut novel comes out next month with HarperCollins Children's Books, and it's called Wolf Siren, and it's a loose Red Riding Hood retelling with a visually impaired protagonist, because the things that keep me awake at night are, why does Red Riding Hood not recognize that her grandmother's a wolf? I started Disabled Tales 3 years ago to this very day. So happy third birthday to Disabled Tales. And I started it on a little bit of a whim, just thinking it would be really cool to have a place where people could explore ideas like the one I just mentioned, but explore the representation of disability in folklore and fairy tales. And yeah, in the last 3 years, we've published a whole range of fiction, poetry, essays, and artwork that are directly linked to this very theme. And yeah, similarly to this symposium, I started it thinking, I'm sure some people will be interested, but was genuinely blown away by the welcoming corner of then Twitter, now X, that I found, and just the sheer volume of submissions that I still get for the website. It's been an absolute joy. So when Nicola reached out and said, "Oh, we should do a conference or a symposium," yeah, I was all for it. Thought it would be amazing. And we put out our call for abstracts, and we were talking about this a little bit before we hit record. We hope people would be interested, but we could have put out that call for abstracts and met with radio silence, and there would be no event. So we are delighted that we collectively had this idea, but our huge thanks go to our speakers for responding to that call for abstracts, which has led to today and also tomorrow. A little bit more on that is that our speakers have been incredible, because we have naturally wanted to make this event as accessible as possible, which has meant extra work on their part, considering they are already giving up their time to present to you today for free. We wanted the event to be free so as many people could come as possible. They've provided advanced materials summarizing their talks, key definitions, written in plain English, as well as many of their presentations and scripts being available ahead of time. So yeah, honestly, to all our speakers who are here, and I will reiterate this tomorrow, a huge thank you to you guys, because honestly, without you, this event would just be me and Nicola sat on Zoom, so it would not be anywhere near as fun. Before we begin with our first speaker, there's just a few classic Zoom housekeeping things I want to go through. I have posted them in the chat, but it will be way at the top now, at the top of everyone's weather updates and hellos. But firstly, ideally try and remain muted while our presenters are speaking, which is a pretty standard Zoom request. Secondly, there are quite a lot of you, and we are going to do our best to monitor the chat as we go along. At the end of each session, we will have a discussion time, a Q&A, where you'll have your chance to ask questions to the speakers. At that time, you can raise your hand. We'll try and keep an eye out for that, and you can unmute and ask. But if you want to post a question in the chat, just to help us find them, if you could begin your message with the word question, ideally in capitals, and if it's directed at a specific speaker, their name would also be just really helpful to make sure we can find all of your questions, and that the discussion time is devoted to discussion rather than me and Nicola hunting for your questions. Also, feel free to post your question again if we seem to have missed it. Finally, again, at the top of the chat, I have reposted the Google Drive where you can find the presentations, scripts, and the like that our wonderful speakers have sent in advance, if that will help anyone for accessibility reasons or just out of sheer curiosity. Some are also available for tomorrow's as well. So if you want to look at those, they are available. So I think that was my welcome, introductory, thank you spiel. Nicola, did I miss anything that you can think of?
No, I don't think so. I think we can crack on. So just to
Okay.
say that our presenters have been given 15 minutes and then 5 minutes for questions, and there'll be kind of changeover time. So bear with us in those there may be some slippage. What we really wanted to do in this webinar was to, as Beth has said, explore the kind of nuances of disability representation. We did want to challenge stigma, but we also wanted to preserve the kind of character and the power of some of the archetypes that are there. And our themes really are to do with empowerment and challenge and collaboration, and how we can, as we collaborate together, we can actually confront and manage negative stereotypes in a really creative way. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. We've got three presentations. First of all, that's Lauren with Huff Puff, Louise with Woodlands as Metaphor, and Charlotte talking about the Seven Dwarves. Fascinating presentations, as you'll discover. So I have two bios from Laura and Louise, and they will be posted in the Google Docs. But Lauren's from Alaska, and she's a psychologist, neurodiverse writer, and is the mother of a young lady who communicates non-verbally. And she loves looking at innovative approaches. She's a member of numerous organizations, has an MA in Jungian psychology, educator, writer, and advocate for special needs. And her debut picture book, hatched in April 2017, it's called Egg. And if you can put afterwards in the chat, Laura, where we can find that, that would be absolutely great, because I'm sure when they've seen Huff Puff, everybody's going to want to buy a copy. So without further ado, you should be able to share your screen, Laura. Huff Puff is, I'm sure you'll feel, is a really fantastic way of opening our symposium.
Thank you guys so much for doing this. It's a really beautiful, beautiful thing that you have given the world. And I'm really glad to be part of this in whatever form it takes. So thank you. I do have two cats running around and hopefully they won't interrupt too much. But here's my little story. Huff Puff Academy, where the rumble of construction collides with the rubble of demolition. Wolfie wanted to be part of her family's blow the house down demolition business. There was just one problem. Her asthma wheezed more than it whooshed, but Wolfie had a plan. With tingling paws and buzzing ears, Wolfie set off on her first day of school, but her cough, cough, wheeze slowed her run to a walk, to a pause, squeeze. On her, hold on one second. Little pictures in the way. On her predominantly pig-attended classroom, Wolfie wheezed once again, outnumbered, out of place, and out of breath. Wolfie growled between coughs, determined to succeed in demolition, no matter what. She found her chair and waited. I want to break. I want to smash. I want to run around and crash. Oops. Uh-oh. Oh, here we go. Sorry about that. Wolfie growled between coughs, determined to succeed in demolition no matter what. She found her chair and waited. I want to break. I want to smash. I want to run around and crash. I want to blow the house down. No demolition today, said their teacher. First, we build with straw. Building with straw? Wolfie's nose twitched. Her lungs wheezed. Then, achoo! Meanwhile, the rest of Team Piggly dove right in, and Wolfie had to step away. But nothing, cough, cough, wheeze, wheeze, squeeze, was going to stop her. Breathe, because the pigs needed directions. Stop, said Wolfie. You slide left. On it. You, said Wolfie. Scoot right. Got it. You, hop over left, said Wolfie. Then slip under right. Whee! Braided straw, said the teacher. Unusual. Great job, Team Piggly. Tomorrow we build with sticks. Howling and bouncing with glee, Wolfie wiggled home, part of a successful team, but then worry wormed in. Would her huff and puff ever be strong enough for sticks? Would the team like her stick weaving idea? You break twigs, Wolfie explained. You smash them apart, but no crashing, lots of smushing, and I'll weave. Impressive design and teamwork. A+, said the teacher. Tomorrow, bricks. Back home, Wolfie worried. How could she help with dusty bricks? Then she had an idea. She plotted, planned, and searched through her supplies until, there, she said, everything Team Piggly needs to succeed. At school, piles of bricks stacked high waited. Team Piggly quivered with excitement, waiting for the ring. You get to break ground, Wolfie shouted at the first pig. You, she paused and pointed, get to smash rocks. And you get to run around and crash the wheelbarrow. I'll overlap and stack. The day was a blueprint of success without a single cough, cough, wheeze. And the results? Astounding and ingenious, said their teacher. They get a good night's sleep, everyone. Oh, sorry, I'm not used to doing presentations. Astounding and ingenious, said their teacher. Get a good night's sleep, everyone. Tomorrow, bring your safety gear. It's demolition day. Wolfie's heart pounded. She couldn't wait to start, but cough, cough. Hard hats and gloves, their teachers reminded them. And don't forget your goggles and overalls. Wolfie's ears buzzed. Wheeze, wheeze. Already feeling defeated, Wolfie wilted and whimpered. Her whole body slumped into a crumpled heap inside the heavy gear. She simply couldn't breathe. Squeeze. Deflated, Wolfie sat on the sidelines until, help, Wolfie! We're struck by the hair of our chinny chin chins. She had to help her team. The braided straw was tough, but with Wolfie's directing, Team Piggly was tougher. Wolfie soon untangled the puzzle of messy woven sticks, and Team Piggly triumphed. Demolition was going to be great until bricks impenetrable. Wolfie whimpered, her chest tightened. Their early success at building made Team Piggly a failure at demolition, or so she thought. Well done, all. A+ for everyone, her teacher said. I couldn't have planned or done better myself. Arriving the next morning at the Huff Puff Academy, Wolfie discovered she had a bigger and better blow the house down dream. Teaching. We'll teach you how to break. We'll teach you how to smash. We'll teach you how to run around and crash. And we'll teach you how to build, all safely. Huff puff, hooray.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for that fantastic start to our webinar. Has anybody got a question for Lauren about the story? I mean,
Nicola, I think we were going to do questions at the end.
we are. Oh, right. Okay. So we're just going to, sorry, I've got an old version of the program, which has got 5 minutes questions afterwards. Right. So we'll go straight on then.
Sorry, Laura. Is that okay?
My kid's not awake yet, so yes.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, there is a question which is about SEL approaches from your biography. So if you can just address that in the chat, Lauren, that would be great. Sure. So we're moving on to Louise Kenwood's piece about woodlands. She's a writer, artist, and psychologist, and the editor of a groundbreaking anthology called Moving Mountains, which is about writing nature through disability and illness. She set up Zebra Psych with the aim of raising awareness of energy limiting chronic illness, and has co-produced another anthology called Disturbing the Body. Louise was named in the 23-24 Disability Power 100 list. So we're so thrilled to have you with us, and is currently developing a good practice guide for practitioner psychologists working with people with these conditions, and has most recently worked on the AHRC Imagining Future Healthcare project, which is the origin of your presentation today, Louise. And Louise is a postgraduate researcher at Manchester Metropolitan. So over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nicola. I shall pull up my presentation. Okay, it's changed. Are you able to? I'm trying to share my screen. Sorry, I should have.
You should be able to do that. I've enabled share screen for everyone.
Oh, okay. Hold on a second.
There we go.
Can you see the PowerPoint, or is it?
We can, yeah.
Oh,
if you click on play slideshow at the very top, or the PowerPoint slideshow, and do play show. No, moving along
to where it says Zoom buttons that are getting in the way. Sorry.
Yeah. Where it says slideshow. After animations. Or tools, after tools on the PowerPoint one. So you've got to, now if you go to slideshow, play from start.
Apologies. Rookie.
No, it's fine. It always happens to me as well.
Thank you very much for patience. So in terms of an audio description, I'm a white woman with short dark hair and wearing glasses in a lime green polo neck with a backdrop of some fabulous ferns just to set the scene of the woodlands. And as Nicola said, this comes from an AHRC supported project which was led by Professor Bethan Evans, who I think is here with us, which is very exciting. And I have a acknowledgement slide at the end to make sure I get to. Okay. So in this session, I'll be reading from a new fairy tale I've written, Can You Hear Me Sing? It was developed after working with two groups of people living with energy limiting conditions as part of an AHRC project called Imagining Future Healthcare. I ran workshops drawing on fairy tales as inspiration for creative writing and wrote this piece in response to the workshops. Using fairy tales as prompts meant that I could connect with the imagination and fantasy element of the brief, while also anchoring the work in structural and systemic realities. Fairy tales come from a tradition of establishing order in society, grounded in the inequalities and inequities of the society they're created in. They also help to make sense of things that happen to and around us. They make space for understanding difference and complexity. The field of energy limiting conditions is an incredibly complex one, and this project followed previous work also led by Bethan Evans titled Disbelief and Disregard, which highlighted how poorly understood and poorly treated people with these disabilities are in society, but also in medicine and healthcare. So I've tried to incorporate all of these things in a way that brings a new access point to these complexities of neglect and harm and the huge grief and loss for people who live with these conditions. I chose a woodland theme for this piece. Lots of ideas about the natural world were generated in the workshops, including connections across species and finding new ways of communicating with others and of feeling understood. Woodlands and forests are commonly depicted in fairy tales as places of fear and danger and sites of transformation. So often read as children, fairy tales contribute to our formative learning that help to form our beliefs about ourselves and the world we live in. We ingest them whole, as Andrea Dworkin wrote. We had its values and consciousness imprinted on our minds as cultural absolutes. We have taken the fairy tales of childhood with us into maturity, chewed but still lying in the stomach as real identity. Fairy tales are often used to highlight what difference means. Difference and disability are so often portrayed as the things in need of change. The trope of the evil or bad is often the aspect that's different. I'm struck particularly by Amanda Leduc's book, Disfigured, on fairy tales, disability and making space. In the introduction, she writes, why, in all of these stories about someone who wants to be something or someone else, was it always the individual who needed to change and never the world? In a later section from the book, she writes, in the medical model, disability is both a reality of life as well as a kind of storytelling. Every disabled story becomes a narrative, a story that has everything to do with what culture perceives of as good, able-bodiedness, beauty, and bad, disability, disfigurement. A disability thus becomes a symbol for everyone else, operating as a kind of intellectual bogeyman for the well, a whispering darkness that sits on the edge of the perceived order of the world. Before we had the medical model, before we had science, we had storytelling in all of its inscrutable magic. How else to make sense of something than by telling a story about it? When you make something inconceivable into a story, suddenly it gains legitimacy. Suddenly it operates in the realm of the possible. For many energy-limiting conditions, there is only limited medical understanding. For some, there is an entire absence of a medical model. For people with severe ME/CFS, for instance, there's no medical framework or care pathway in the NHS, nor doctors who will take responsibility for these patients. So while the medical model is flawed in considering disability, it fails twofold for people with energy-limiting conditions. In part, this difficulty is because of the complexity of the illnesses. In part, it's due to a willful misunderstanding and misconstruction, previously hailed as psychogenic, hysterical. It's difficult to change these stories once unleashed into the world. The only clear-minded way of making sense is through new stories. Fairy tales offer new possibilities. Can You Hear Me Sing captures the history of ME/CFS and similar energy-limiting conditions and the medical neglect of patients as a result, combined, I hope, with a hope for better future for what could be possible. So I shall read from the piece, and I think there's some visual descriptions to put in the chat. So this is the first one. Can you hear me sing? Once upon a time, deep in the woods of Pem, where the bluebells grow, the people were sick. Their bodies had stopped, and no one knew why. At first, the creatures in the forest weren't worried. They'd seen it before. They thought the people were hibernating, bodies shutting down for the winter. It had been a long winter, but the buds were starting to show on the trees, and new shoots pushed up through the autumn shed leaves. But the people of Pem still did not stir. The squirrels thought they were just slow to wake, knocking on the trees as they passed. The squirrels knew the dormouse. She never liked coming out of her nest in the spring. The nest was warm and cosy, and there was still a chill in the air outside. As new bright leaves began to unfurl on the beach, and then the oak, the people slept on, fitful, restless sleep. The rabbits visited. They stroked the sick people's heads and left lush new buds for breakfast, but still they were not roused. The ivy grew thick, new leaves turning gold and falling, piling up around the sleeping people. The people of Pem felt frightened and alone. They couldn't be seen anymore where they slept, ivy knotted and tangled all around them, with a new leaf fall each year. Slowly they became covered entirely, and all the creatures in the forest almost forgot they were there. Winter after winter, the people grew colder and sicker. Each year the squirrels assumed the people to be hibernating, and the rabbits thought them rude. The people called out over and over, but the squirrels couldn't hear, and the rabbits had stopped visiting. The leaves that piled up made it harder to be heard, and no one remembered they were there anymore, so no one was listening. The people of Pem tried and tried to say what was happening, tapping out messages on tree roots and catching the breeze with a whistle. They found ways of sharing their stories with each other, of pain and frustration, brain fog and failing systems, of all the things they wanted to do and be. They shared how hard it was to be sick, but mostly how upsetting it was to be so misunderstood by the squirrels and the rabbits, how hard it was knowing their stories went unheard. They created music from the movement of the breeze through the new leaves in spring. They became skilled at sending messages, and they learnt to sing. The people of Pam knew they needed more help, but no one who could help could hear them. They tried to reach the nearby clearing of Mep, where there were doctors and nurses and carers. Each time they pushed further, tried to sing more loudly, to carry their song out of the woods. But they were left exhausted, needed longer to recover, and their song grew quieter. One winter it grew so cold the people of Pem were dying. Occasionally one would be found near a path, stranded and alone, having tried to outrun the sickness. The squirrels offered help and brought fresh hazelnuts for them to eat, but the people could no longer open the nuts. The squirrels told the people the good ones to open them on, but the people couldn't reach the good trees and didn't have the strength to open the nuts. They returned to their beds without food to continue their fretful sleep. The people of Pem were so upset they couldn't eat the nuts. The squirrels felt affronted the people hadn't eaten them. Sometimes people from Pem were found further up the stream beyond the woods, exhausted where they tried to wash in the water, but unable to get back up the bank. They'd slipped in and drowned. Carried along in the stream, they arrived in nearby clearings. The people finding them didn't always realise they'd come from Pem, with no distinguishing features. The drowned people of Pem were thought unusual or accidental, or simply that they had chosen to drown. Each time the people of Pem learned of these losses and sad tales, they retreated to their mossy beds in the trees and along the bank of the stream. They shared their stories with one another and remembered the people they had lost. A new verse of the song was created between them, and their chorus began to grow. They sang about their hopes and fears, their dreams and their nightmares, of what they had lost and what might be possible. With each new song, they felt a little less alone and scared. One winter, the storms came. The wind blew more strongly, the rain fell with more force. The people of Pem were worried they could not manage any longer without help. There were more of them now than ever before. Others arrived daily to the forest, bodies stopping everywhere. The rain did not stop, and the water rose higher, filling the stream. The stream got so high it flooded its banks, carrying some of the people further out of the woods and towards a path. The storms blew down trees, opening up small clearings. The birds started to visit, finding new places to build their nests and materials to make them from, the sticks and leaves that had fallen in the winds. As the nests filled with eggs and hatched, the fledglings began to explore the woods. They began to notice the people of Pem, and they started to sing to them. The people of Pem began to stir, waking up to the bluebells and the wood anemones and the beautiful bird song. The people of Pem started to share the songs they had made, stitching their stories together as they sang. They were songs from the woods, of what it was like to be so sick, how afraid and alone they have been, but they also sang songs of what they had been before. They had not always been people of Pem. These were rich and wonderful stories of their lives before, of the ordinary and the extraordinary. The birds carried their songs out of the forest to the people of Mep, who they hoped might hear them and would help. There was a hospital at Mep with doctors and nurses and carers. The people of Mep had not listened to the bird song before. Some of them had heard of the people of Pem, but like the squirrels and rabbits first thought, assumed them to be hibernating or rude. Each year, more birds made nests in the woods, and more fledglings hatched and sang to the people of Mep, carrying the songs from Pem to the doctors and nurses and carers, hoping this would be the year they would hear them. Each year, a few more were noticed. With careful listening, the people of Mep learnt the song from the birds. They began to understand how frightened and alone the people of Pem had been, how they grieved for so much and so many they had lost. They began to hear the song of how hard it was to find food and sleep well, how difficult it was to get to the stream to wash, how upset they were that they had been forgotten, thought rude, and assumed to be hibernating. Each year, more songs of the people of Pem were heard, and more doctors and nurses and carers listened for them. The people of Mep started to visit Pem, at first getting lost in the woods, tripping over roots and slipping in the mud, old maps outdated and misleading. But gradually they found Pem and made new paths for others to follow, redrawing the maps. Each year, their understanding of the song increased. Each year, the song of Pem grew. More of the creatures in the woods joined in, and more of the people of Mep listened for and learnt the songs. The birds continued to carry their song across and beyond the woods. Everyone started noticing and listening for their tune. It was an incredible song, and others wondered why they had not heard it before. As the people of Mep understood more of the words and the music of the songs, they started to create their own, singing back to the people of Pem. The birds carried these messages of hope and solidarity from Mep and beyond on their morning chorus, returning each evening with new songs from Pem. Those who heard and understood their song could send help of support, care and nourishment. The rabbits brought food again and lay down beside the people of Pem, offering them warmth and comfort from their soft fur. The squirrels swept and cleaned where they slept, making new blankets of fresh leaves and offering hazelnuts they had already opened, and beech nuts that opened themselves. The rabbits and squirrels plumped up the pillows and mattresses of moss, finding new spaces in the trees for them to sleep, away from the stream where they would be safe and dry. They brought cups of water for them to wash in from the stream in the shells of the acorns and the beech nuts. Each year, the people of Mep learnt something new that could help the people of Pem, and as their knowledge and understanding grew, they began to write songs between them. While the people slept, their song flourished and thrived. While the people of Mep learned more about how to help, the people of Pem could rest a little easier. Their songs grew in strength and volume, their sleep continued, but it was a little more soundly, a little more comfortably, and they no longer felt so frightened and alone. Thank you. And thank you to all the participants who took part in the project and informed the workshop that led to that piece. So it's thanks to the AHRC project led by Bethan Evans, Morag Rose, Anna B. Pereira, working with a number of other researchers and partners.
Wow. Thank you so much. I mean, that I was completely transported during that story, and with those beautiful images. And already we're seeing the kind of huge range that there is in imaginative storytelling, from kind of humor and fun through to this kind of very kind of soothing and really imaginative, both such imaginative presentations. Wonderful. Thank you very, very much. And there's a great comment from Rachel in the chat, Rachel Baker, about COVID that I think is really, really interesting, that I'm sure we will pick up in the discussion. We're going to hand over now to Charlotte. Charlotte, I'm hoping you're here.
I am here. Hello.
Oh, hooray. So you should be able to share your screen, and I'm hoping, because I don't have a bio for you, you're going to introduce yourself as part of your presentation. And I'm just fascinated by this, particularly in the context of, I think there's a new film which raises some very interesting questions about how people of restricted stature get jobs as actors if there's no role for them in Snow White. So over to you, Charlotte.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's lovely to be here. It's fantastic, listening to all these speeches. It's just wonderful. It's such a joy. So yeah, my name's Charlotte. I'm based on the Yorkshire coast in the UK. By day, I run a part-time theatre company, mainly working with adults with disabilities. I also have a background in holistic and integrative health. So I found myself doing a PhD in holistic health in end-of-life care. So I'm kind of juggling those things at the moment. My passion is really about the individual and the whole. And so basically that's the journey I'm going to take you on this afternoon through Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Okay, so here we go. So throughout history, stories have shaped how we see the world and how those are different from us. Now, in the Brothers Grimm original Snow White, 7 dwarfs worked as one, their individuals strengthening their collective whole. They were complete beings, undefined by any single trait. But when Disney reimagined these characters in 1937, something fundamentally changed. Each dwarf received a label, such as grumpy or dopey, reducing the complex individuals to single defining characteristics. And for me, this transformation reflects a deeper philosophical shift in how we understand and represent human difference. So this afternoon, I'll explore briefly how this seemingly simple change in character portrayal reflects competing philosophical approaches to understanding human nature. By examining the evolution of these characters, from their origins in German folklore to their transformation in American animation, we can better understand how the ways that we label and categorize people shape their opportunities, identities, and places in society. And we'll uncover some important insights, I hope, about holistic versus reductionist thinking. So, in the Brothers Grimm version, titled Little Snow White, the dwarfs emerge as a fascinating collective. They aren't distinguished by individual names or reduced to single personality traits. Instead, they function as a unified group, their strength lying in their collective identity and shared purpose. Let me share a particularly revealing passage from the original text. When they came home in the evening and found Snow White lying on the ground, they lifted her up together. So notice how the dwarves act in unison. There's no separation of their actions or assignment of specific roles. So this collaborative approach reflects a deeper truth about human nature, that we are more than just the sum of our individual traits. Now, 1912 saw the first stage adaptation on Broadway, in which the dwarves were given the names of Blick, Flick, Glick, Snick, Plick, Wick, and Quee. Now, these playful rhyming names served a practical theatrical purpose, helping the audience distinguish between characters on stage. However, and this is crucial, these names were essentially neutral labels. So this adaptation represents a middle ground, I suppose, in our story's evolution, a point where the dwarves gained individual identifiers while still maintaining their essential nature as complex, complete characters. So the naming convention preserves the spirit of the Grimm brothers' original collective portrayal. Now, Walt Disney's version in 1937, it saw Disney make a decisive shift by naming the dwarves based on their dominant personality traits. And you can see we have Doc, Grumpy, Happy, and so on. Now, this wasn't just a simple naming exercise, it represented a fundamental shift in how these characters were conceived and presented. Now, what's particularly telling is the list of rejected names that Disney initially considered, including Wheezy, Deafy, and Tubby. And these discarded options reveal something important about the naming strategy. It was explicitly focused on the defining characters through physical characteristics or limitations. And while Disney ultimately chose less problematic names, the underlying approach remained the same, reducing complex characters to single defining traits. Now, Disney explained this decision by saying that they wanted to make each dwarf instantly recognizable to the audience, especially children. And while the goal's understandable from a storytelling perspective, it inadvertently introduced a reductionist approach that would influence how the characters went on to be perceived. So, to truly understand the significance of how these dwarves were portrayed, it's useful to explore two fundamental philosophical approaches to understanding the world and human nature. So the contrasting perspectives of holism and reductionism offer valuable insights into how we view and represent individuals, particularly those with disabilities. If I start with holism, so this was a philosophical approach championed by Aristotle, who was famously declared that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And it wasn't just a clever phrase, it represented a profound understanding of how we could view both nature and human beings. Now, in a holistic view, we cannot truly understand something by breaking it down into its individual parts. Just as you can't understand the beauty of a painting by analysing each brushstroke in isolation, you can't necessarily fully understand a person by reducing them to their individual characteristics or traits. So, briefly looking at this rather boring diagram, we can just see how each element connects to and influences each other element. Together, they create something more meaningful than they could independently. And this is exactly how the dwarves were portrayed in the original Grimm story, as complete beings whose individual traits work together to create a stronger whole. So in contrast, Descartes believed that to understand something complex, we should break it down into its simplest components. And one of his famous quotes was, "Divide each difficulty into as many parts as is feasible and necessary to resolve it." Now in this diagram, we can see everything is neatly categorized and separated. Each part exists independently and is defined by its own boundaries. And this is precisely what Disney did with the dwarves, breaking down their collective identity into 7 distinct labelled personalities. Now, while this reductionist approach can be absolutely useful in some contexts, it can be somewhat problematic when applied to human beings. So by reducing each dwarf to a single characteristic, sleepy or grumpy, Disney inadvertently demonstrated the limitations of reductionist thinking. The labels, while memorable, effectively confined each character to just a single trait. Watch how sometimes disability labels can sometimes overshadow the full complexity and richness of an individual. So the tension between these philosophical approaches, holism and reductionism, mirrors an ongoing struggle with how we represent and understand disability in society. Do we see people as complete, complex individuals, or do we just simply reduce them to their most visible characteristics or challenges? Now, in the Brothers Grimm version, the dwarfs embody the holistic. Now, let me share a particularly illuminating passage from the original text. They lit their 7 little candles, and when it was now light within the cottage, they saw that someone had been there, for everything was not in the same order in which they had left it. So we can hear in this passage how the description presents the dwarves as a coordinated unit. The text doesn't say one dwarf lit a candle while another looked around. Instead, their actions are described collectively, emphasizing their unity and shared purpose. And this approach allows each dwarf to maintain their individual qualities while contributing to the group's strength. The original story also describes their work in the mountains, where they dug and searched for gold. And this collaborative approach showcases how their different abilities complemented each other without any single trait defining an individual. Their physical stature, which might have been considered a disability in other contexts, is simply presented as one aspect of who they were, not their defining characteristic. Now, in contrast, Disney's adaptation exemplifies reductionist thinking both through characterization and visual design. Consider Dopey, he's rendered mute-like and childlike, his entire character reduced to these traits, which became his defining features. Or take Grumpy, whose complexity is flattened into a single emotional state. While he does show some development through his eventual acceptance of Snow White, he remains primarily defined by his grumpiness. And what's particularly telling is how Disney's character design reinforces the reductions. Each dwarf's physical appearance, from their posture to their facial expressions, is crafted to emphasize their assigned trait. For example, Doc's glasses, an authoritative stance, Sleepy's perpetually drooping eyelids, Happy's ever-present smile, and so on. These visual clues serve to further cement their reduced identities. So the implications of these two different approaches become clear when we examine how each version handles moments of crisis. In the Grimm version, when Snow White is discovered as apparently dead, the dwarfs respond as a unified group. The text tells us, they lifted her up, looked to see whether they could find anything poisonous, unlaced her, combed her hair, washed her with water and wine, but all was of no avail. And if we compare this to Disney's version of the same scene, where each dwarf reaction is individualized and predictable based on their assigned trait, Grumpy remains skeptical, Happy tries to find silver linings, and Doc takes charge but fumbles with his words. And while these characterizations might be entertaining, they demonstrate how reductionist labeling can limit the depth and authenticity of character representation. When we reduce individuals to single characteristics, whether in fairy tales or real life, we risk missing that amazing rich complexity of human experience. Just as the Disney's dwarfs became confined by their labels, people with disabilities can face some similar reductions, where a single aspect of their identity overshadows all of the others. These contrasting approaches to portraying the dwarfs fundamentally alter not just the characters themselves, but the entire meaning and message of Snow White. So if we examine the differences from the philosophical frameworks, they transform the story's themes and what this reveals about representation in fairy tales and beyond. In the Brothers Grimm version, the dwarfs' collective identity serves as a crucial narrative purpose. Their unity creates a stark contrast with the isolation of both Snow White and the Evil Queen. Snow White finds sanctuary not just in a physical place, but within a community that values cooperation and mutual support. The dwarf's collective strength highlights one of the tale's core messages, the power of community over individualism. And when Disney reimagined these characters through a reductionist lens, the story's meaning shifted for me significantly. While still they help us to Snow White, each dwarf's labelled identity turns them into character types rather than fully realised beings. Their interactions become more about managing different personality quirks than demonstrating the power of collective action. And therefore, for me, it transforms the story from one about community and acceptance to one about individual characteristics and their management. And this transformation reflects a broader pattern in how fairy tales represent difference. When characters are reduced to labels, whether they're dwarves defined by personality traits or witches defined by wickedness, we lose that nuanced messaging that traditional fairy tales often contain about human nature and community. Consider how the original tale's portrayal of the dwarf's physical difference worked. The height's simply one aspect of who they were, neither the definitive characteristic as a surprisingly progressive model for understanding human variation. I see that the Disney version actually took a step backwards in terms of representation by making individual traits into defining characteristics. For me, the way we tell stories shapes how we understand ourselves and others. In fairy tales, transformation often carries deep meaning. The evolution of Snow White's dwarfs, from the Grimm brothers' unified community to Disney's labeled individuals, reveals a profound shift in how we tell stories about human differences. Like a mirror in Snow White's castle, this transformation reflects back to us on our own society's tendency to reduce complex individuals to simple labels. The Grimm brothers showed us a world where difference has strengthened communities without requiring explanation or categorization. They're dwarfs, unnamed, but they're complete. Remind us that sometimes the most powerful representations are those that resist the urge to label and to divide. The story of Snow White endures not just because it's a tale of good triumphing over evil, because it shows us different ways of understanding ourselves and communities. So let us choose to tell stories that, like the original Seven Dwarfs, celebrate our collective strength while honouring our individual wholeness.
Wow, what a fantastic closure to the first part of our webinar. That was really, really amazing. I've got so many questions myself. We're ahead of ourselves, which is absolutely brilliant. So what we would now like to do is to open up for discussion for kind of 10 minutes or so, and then we can take a break before our next presentations. So does anybody have any questions for any of our speakers? So Beth and I will try and monitor the chat.
Yeah, there was as people maybe have time to type them, there was a couple that were posted during the discussion. So Angela asked Laura, what are SEL approaches? Laura, if your kids have not woken up and you're still here,
I am.
would you be able to give a little definition of that for us?
A social emotional language. It's just one of the things that we use over here to highlight. Well, I'm sure Nicola can expand on that even more. But yeah, it's social emotional language.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. We had another one which I tried to answer in the chat. I thought the question was about was the original tale called Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and I checked my Jack Zipes translation of the first edition, and it is just listed as Little Snow White, but the follow-up seems to say that be asking, well, saying if you ask any German child now what's the story called, I'm sure they would say now it's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, as would we in English. So yeah, I might have misinterpreted what was being asked there in terms of the original name of that story, if we later put emphasis on the Seven Dwarfs, or was that in the original. But you can see my answer in the chat if you want to have a look. We have questions coming in. Nicola, Tasha has put a question in. Would you mind reading it out?
Yeah, absolutely. So this relates to what I was saying earlier on. So this is a question for Charlotte. Tasha, I don't know if you're there. Do you just want to put your question directly? And unmute yourself.
As she's typed it, she probably...
Right, okay. So Tasha says, I just wondered if you had any thoughts on the way Hollywood casts dwarf roles in movies. So Peter Dinklage criticized a lot of these roles many people thought he was hypocritical for doing so, since he'd taken reductive roles earlier on in his career, which Tasha and I both think is a pretty silly comment. But there seems to have been a shift towards casting small people in these roles, rather than trying to portray them in a well-rounded way. And she's wondering, why do you think this is? Is it because of the public's response, potential discomfort to people with physical differences, or more to do with Hollywood's freedom to make fun of taller actors who are then digitally shrunk without seeming unproblematic? The live action Snow White hasn't come out yet, but she and the rest of us would be super interested in your thoughts of the difference of portrayal between the two.
Oh, that's a big question for a Monday afternoon, isn't it? I think if we try and take away the differences when we cast, and I'm only thinking from my personal view in terms of theatre, we take away those differences for whatever reason, and I don't know why ultimately these reasons are done. We risk that richness, don't we? Because we are all different. And so you actually then you get into a situation where there's no representation because we've moved so far the other way. So for me, when I talk about sort of the holism and bringing everything together, it's just I find it bizarre that there's all these changes and they're not, for me, what I would consider inclusive. And I think there's different narratives that go on throughout the world and for different reasons. But for me, I was like, when I heard that they weren't going to be using what you would call traditional act, I was like, well, that's just bizarre and not sort of inclusive in my view. I don't know why.
Right, and Kenzie Scott has also picked up on this. I think it's really interesting in relation to the fact that in other respects, there is criticism of non-disabled actors taking disabled people's roles. I mean, I'm not sure if one would call small stature a disability, actually. It's just a physical characteristic. So thanks for having a go at that, Charlotte. Morag also had a question for you, which was about how the change in the dwarves relates to evolving media technologies and perception of audience. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that a little bit, Morag. It might be to do with this possibility of digital versions of individuals. Did you get that, Charlotte?
Yeah, I just can't quite. I'm just looking in the chat. Is it just like an expansion on?
So it's, how does the change in the dwarves relate to the changing, I think, representation of the dwarves relate to evolving media technologies and the audience perceptions?
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not like a real big media-y kind of like person. I think I really enjoy rawness and truth. And I think we can get so far removed from things, but it is the way that a lot of the world is going. And when I work with people with different disabilities, everybody, has that entitlement to be represented. And I think just saying, oh, well, we could just do that digitally and we could just remove that again, it just takes something away from truth, and it takes something away from human beings and who we are. And that's just a whole different sort of like kind of thing and rabbit hole to go down. But I just think we're humans. There's something about being human and just this is who we are and what we can actually bring to life, as opposed to just this digitalization. Having said that, we're all sat on Zoom and it's wonderful that it can connect us. So everything in its place, I think, is what I would say.
Thank you. Another question for you, and then, well, Bethan Evans has just posted a reference to the work of Erin Pritchard at Liverpool Hope on the representation of dwarfism in media, and I've just asked you if you can put a link. Oh my goodness, this is a theme that's just going to run and run. The previous one, so I will get to the later one in a minute. Question for Charlotte: how do you balance the original only describing the dwarves collectively? Now, I thought about this, without individuals' traits, feeding into perceptions of certain people being the same. So a tendency to look at, people with learning disabilities or whatever disabilities as just a kind of collective group without individual traits. How do you balance that, Charlotte?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question, isn't it? And I think when I look at traditional storytelling, I just look at it for what it is, and that it wasn't there. That the Grimm brothers, they wrote it how they saw it, how life was, and that representation, a group of people working together. And so it's interesting that they didn't choose to bring out the individual characters, but there wasn't necessarily, was there a need? Did it serve the story at that moment in time? That was how it was. And I think as we develop and we we move forward and we understand stories in different ways, we get challenged with, oh, let's bring this in, and why did they not do that? But for me, something about stories is just that simplicity, is just enjoying it for what it is without anything else, without all the complexities of what kind of comes into it. Beautiful story, group of people look after Snow White, epic, how wonderful. And for me, I suppose I don't question it as much as when I see it in a very different way, like I'm just going to give all these people labels, then I'm like, whoa, what's going on here, versus, oh, I've really enjoyed that story. I'm not sure that quite answers the question, but that's kind of how it feels.
Yeah, no, it's a really good go there. I'm just going to read a fascinating comment from Kathy Ray here. Ray, I hope I pronounced your name right, Kathy. I have dwarfism and I'm really not a fan of most of the narratives around the new Snow White film. I feel like many people are arguing for and against people with dwarfism being cast in the film rather than what we should be arguing against such a reductionist and problematic remake existing in the first place. If the Seven Dwarfs are the only roles people with dwarfism should get, then I think we have to really examine why we're so comfortable ring fencing them in that way and not expanding our expectations to see people like us in a rich array of roles. I've just watched, some crime thing on television. I get them all muddled up. Where there is a social worker who has dwarfism, who's just portrayed as a social worker. And there's also the wonderful character in Silent Witness, who's a really very feisty, wonderful character in her own right. So I think that hopefully is beginning to change. I want to shift to some questions for Laura and Louise. These are in the chat and we can pick them up. Some of the ones we haven't managed to address, we'll come back to at the end of the day. Beth and I will work overtime to make sure we get them represented. Laura and Louise, wait, I'm just making sure that I'm picking this up. So the first one I can see is, why do you think creative approaches to fairy tale discussions are so important in this social political moment? And so, Laura,
Yeah,
would you
I
like to
think
address that one? And then Louise?
I'm sure Louise has a lot to say on this as well, but I think that tapping into the archetypes around us and giving it structure with a new perspective, I think is vital to surviving this political social movement. Louise, what do you think?
Yeah, I think for me the reason for choosing fairy tales as the topic for the workshop, but also to kind of draw it into the outcome from the project, was it seems a particularly contentious collection of conditions where there is no clear, I mean, sometimes there is a clear kind of medical explanation, but with so many people, there's delayed diagnoses, there's delayed or no treatment available. There's a lot of empty space that people are left waiting or unknowing, a kind of undiagnosis, and uncertainty. And there's similarly a kind of a healthcare becomes quite a challenging. I could go on for ages about this, so I'll try not to. but because of, I mean, ME CFS is a particularly good example, long COVID increasingly as well, where there's kind of conditions that have historically been contested by medical professions or are difficult to diagnose because there's no single test that can be done, or characteristic symptoms that are easily differentiated from other diagnoses. So I think the fairy tale gives us somewhere to put that kind of empty space, that uncertainty in, and to explore some of those different roles and experiences in a way that's maybe less threatening or less challenging than might be the case within a kind of medical setting, if that makes sense. Am I understanding the question properly? I think the fairy tales give that scope for exploring and trying things out. Yeah, and kind of the use of metaphor, I think, is enormously
I think you're right. And I think that it's because in my mind, fairy tales are the acorn that start the whole conversation. It brings us to a starting point and the ability to explore within all of these different archetypes. So yeah, I agree with you.
Thanks very much, and I'm sure that that's a question that we're going to come back to. Just before we move on to the big one, which is what do we say to people who think fairy tales shouldn't be rewritten, which I think, again, might be a good one for the end of the day. Question for both Laura and Louise. How did you construct your fairy tales and decide what themes and morals you wanted to focus on? So perhaps we'll, start with...
For me, it was I just loved taking an original fairy tale and thinking, okay, I have asthma. I've been an athlete. I've had to deal with things. What would happen if the wolf had asthma? Well, how would that change the story? What would that do? What would happen if the pigs were actually more destructive than the wolf? I mean, it's just flipping things upside down because you have a different perspective in the world that you're living in. I think it's a really beautiful thing.
Lovely, thank you. And Louise?
Yes, I think I was keen to draw as many of the elements that were generated within the workshops from the people that were participating in the project, but to make it cohesive so it doesn't follow a particular fairy tale, but draws on inspiration from lots of ideas of woodlands being fearful, or places of transformation, or places to avoid. And kind of to weave those ideas into the narrative that I understood in terms of the history of some of these conditions, but also some of the experiences I've had personally with lived experience of some of these conditions as well, to try to make it a cohesive narrative thread throughout, to pick up some of the main issues, as well as drawing in the imaginative ideas that the participants in the workshops had.
Thank you so much. And the question I had for you is, are you going to set this to music? Actually, Louise, I feel it would be absolutely wonderful to have a musical soundtrack. I'm going to suggest we take a break at this point because we've been going for an hour and a quarter. So how long would people like? 5 minutes? 10 minutes? What do you think, Beth? You're muted. Beth, I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. I muted myself because my dog was growling. We still have we originally were gonna stop in 10 minutes. We still have, there are still more questions in the chat. If people want to take a break, please feel free, but there were still a few more questions.
Okay, shall we, are
we
people
were
happy to
planning
go
to
on
break
with...
at 25
Yeah.
parts with our original plan.
Yeah, okay, because some of these questions are so great. I'll go with that. I just didn't want to tire people out. Beth, do you want to pick up on the ones you've noticed that we haven't had yet?
Yes, let me. There was. I've been scrolled back to the bottom. Just give me 1 second.
So there is a point about Wicked broadening the representation of dwarfism beyond Munchkins, made by Kirsty Stanley, which is a relevant point. But have you found
Well,
the
did we touch on the question about what do we say to people who say they shouldn't be rewritten? I think you said we
we
would get.
haven't yet, but let's go with that one. So I think
I think a few people were interested in hearing. That was a general
absolutely.
question.
Okay.
People were
Yeah.
interested in that.
Um,
Yeah. So the question was specifically, what would be your comeback, I suppose, to people who say that fairy tale shouldn't be rewritten?
should we go to Charlotte? Charlotte first, since give Laura and Louise a little bit of time to think about that. Charlotte, your view on don't rewrite fairy tales.
Well, if we start having rules like that, we're not going to be doing anything, are we? Do you know what I mean? That's just, where does it stop? No, I'm all for it. Why not? We've all got different perspectives. And I think there's something else that we can bring out of it, because that's like saying this is the only version that we can ever do. And then that means nobody else's perspective is valuable in any way. And that we can't express ourselves as things move on and where we are and who we are in our cultural and societies. So nah, I'm not for that. No, definitely not.
Okay, what about Laura and Louise? Any thoughts on that?
I agree. What's the harm in bringing in a new perspective? Seriously, what's the harm in it? You I agree with Charlotte.
Right, and Louise?
Yeah, I think Kirsty's just put in the chat as well. Fairy tales started as an oral tradition, and I think that through history they have changed with the retelling. And I think is there something like there's only 7 novel stories anyway, so everything is a version of one of those 7.
I'm going to just voice the counter argument, which is that I think I don't know if whoever put that one was thinking about the way in which fairy tales get tidied up and the difficult elements taken out for certain audiences. So the kind of trigger warnings things. So that I don't know if it's an apocryphal story, but the one about the parents who sue the theatre when the child is frightened in a pantomime version of Red Riding or a theatrical version of Red Riding Hood. And I think those are problematic. I think the sanitizing of fairy tales, rather in the way that Charlotte has described, that take out the difficult elements, really they kind of defang them, if you like, or they take out precisely the elements which, and I can remember as a child, I can remember being absolutely terrified by the illustrations of Baba Yaga in the Red Fairy book version of the Russian fairy tale, and so they were frightening, but there's the best stories have such a they've been told so often and in such ways that the structure, the way that they're constructed, is reassuring and provides some kind of closure, even if the endings are difficult. The way that stories are told holds you in what I think is a safe space. But so I think it's always a kind of teetering between, how do you manage the anxieties that may be raised, and how do you deal with when we're all dealing with this culture that is very, very risk averse. I don't know if anybody's got any comments about that.
I would just like to chime in because this discussion is not new to like our modern fairy tales. Like the reason the Grimm brothers had so many editions of their fairy tales is because they had those same discussions in those times. What bits were suitable for children, which bits weren't. Like a prime example is Rapunzel falls pregnant in the first edition, and then that is subsequently removed because they thought that was an immoral part of that story. So it's I think the process of retelling fairy tales and navigating this line is part of it, and the line shifts with the times and the audience. And I think what my difficult bits are won't be somebody else's. So I think it's one of those where I would argue that the more retellings, the better, in terms of no one story is going to encompass a whole world's experience. But the more we have, the more chances are someone might read that and think, oh, that really speaks to me. I like that version. And that's fine. That was my chime in, but I'll shush now. In case
And
anyone wants to.
Kenzie Scott has put in a wonderful comment where she's saying that it's a huge literary tradition explicitly to do retellings of a story. She's focusing on the Renaissance, the way that A Midsummer Night's Dream uses fairy tales. As You Like It is an adaptation of Lodge's Rosalind, which was in itself an adaptation of a medieval poem, adapting it to tell new stories. It's a literary tradition. And lots of people saying how much they love retellings. Kirsty, again, sanitizing, censoring, and propaganda is always more of a risk, but we approach stories differently in different ages as long as the original remains. So I think it's making sure that we have access to those different retellings that is really kind of critical rather than.
Yeah, I agree, and I also just wanted to mention in relation to Charlotte's talk, because it's similar to some of my own PhD research in closely reading the traditional versions. Often we can be quite surprised at the disability representation within them. It's not always positive. But for example, I look at The Little Mermaid, Hans Christian Andersen's Little Mermaid, compared to a feminist adaptation, The Surface Breaks, but alongside the Disney versions. And I do think that often our associations with the Disney adaptations or the popularized retellings, we then impose those values on the old ones as if they were there first. Whereas actually in The Little Mermaid, for example, she, yes, is treated like a pet in many ways, made to lie on a cushion. Often people cite the fact that she isn't named, but none of the characters are named. But she is described to have a beautiful voice, is her best feature, not her appearance. She is very communicative. She's described to have expressive eyes. She and the prince hold sort of like quasi conversations through her facial expressions. And that is then later removed in the Disney version where she signs her name on a scroll, but then proceeds to not be able to tell Prince Eric what her name is. So I think there are really interesting things to be done by looking closely at the original versions before we decide they are harmful in terms of their disability representation, because our adaptations that have already been done aren't, as Charlotte said, aren't always a step forward. Sometimes they can be a step sideways or a step backwards. And I think that's something part of this conference has been really fun to explore. What in terms of the keeping the magic element of what do we want to preserve in these stories that have survived for so long?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to come to the final question in this session, and do repeat a question in the chat if we haven't got to it, but one that's particularly close to my heart, from Rachel Baker. Western societies emphasize individualism, so cultural stories tend to latch onto character, whereas fairy tales focus more on story, not character. Is this reflected, or how is this reflected, how this relates to, I guess, person-centered healthcare? Really, really interesting. Any views, those of you who are working with people with disabilities and life, conditions, person-centered healthcare in the context of what Charlotte's saying, any reflections? Stunned into silence. I mean, one of the thoughts I have as a speech and language therapist is, and I think it's something that we've been terribly culpable of in my profession, is that there is very much this focus on individualization, so that it is for us to work with the individual to change. And we do also work with the people around the individual, but what we don't really take into account is the wider social and political context of communication norms, for example. So, and in fact, the biggest changes I think came for deaf young people once, you know, British Sign Language became recognized and is out there and is used in, you know, everywhere and has been recognized culturally. And that's done, well, I don't like to generalize, but, you know, that's just been such a huge advantage in terms of the language skills of young people who are deaf. And, you know, we don't always look at what is the context of the group within which young people are functioning. So as a speech and language therapist, you know, we often teach kids social skills in a group, but it's me as the therapist imparting social skills to children that I don't think have them, rather than looking at how are the youngsters cooperating in a group, what are the skills that they've got, and how can I enable them to do more of that, if you like. So I mean, I think that's an extremely good question, and it's one that we're not encouraged to challenge as allied health professionals, I would say, is the individualisation of healthcare.
Yeah, I mean, I can just chip in. I can't see the original question, so sorry if I've missed the point, but echo what you said, Nicola, in terms of my background is as a psychologist in the NHS, and certainly the kind of history has been around the individual changing, as in kind of, as Amanda Leduc says in her book Disfigured on Fairy Tales, Disability and Making Space, it's why is it the individual that has to change and not society? And I think certainly becoming unwell myself, I've become much more conscious of how different my life could be if society was slightly different. And I think that kind of speaks to the social model of disability enormously.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree, because in the end of life care that I'm looking at, it's all very well that I come in with this, you know, holistic view, personalized, but actually I'm working within the medical model framework. It's the framework that goes, well, yeah, you can have personalized care and all this kind of stuff, but you can only have it under our model. And but what if the model's wrong? Then effectively it's not really that personalized, because it's only personalized within this framework as opposed to a bigger framework. And I do believe it is a real challenge in terms of what you're saying.
Yeah. Thank you. And I'm just going, just before we leave, I realised that there's a hidden question in a comment by Rachel Baker earlier on. Louise, this beautiful story is redolent of the COVID lockdown period, and how for some, nature, birds in particular, became more visible and a mutual consciousness between nature and us was more apparent. Have healthcare services learned from nature?
Oh, wouldn't it be lovely if yeah, there was a point during lockdown where it felt like things could really be different after this. It's such a huge and traumatic and devastating experience. There's so much that we can take away, and it increasingly feels to me as though there's a collective wish, understandably in many respects, to just be done with it, for it to be over, not to speak of it again. When the pandemic continues to rumble, that there continues to be people with being disabled by long COVID and dying of COVID, and that shift in societal change in thinking about a kind of more connected way of being with the natural world and across species and within our species. That I don't lose hope entirely, but it becomes a much more difficult, challenging task, I think, because of that understandable kind of huge denial and wish to move on from things.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Right. Well, we are now going to take a break. So we will, I'm going to pause the recording. Um, and Ella Holmes is our next presenter. She's from Australia, and goodness knows what hour of the day it is or night. So she's very kindly sent her presentation, which Beth is going to share with us. Dangerous disabled roles in fairy tales.
I will. This worked perfectly when I practiced, so let's all hope. Okay.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ella T. Holmes. Thank you so much for tuning into my presentation titled Dead, Dreadful, Dangerous, Disabled Roles in Fairy Tales. Let's jump right in because I have so much to talk about. So to begin, I would like to first clarify which definition of disability that I am working under, and that is any condition of the body or mind that makes it more difficult for the person with the condition to do certain activities and interact with the world around them. Additionally, a person's social and political experiences will differ as a result of said condition. So the three most important pillars here are impairment, activity limitation, and participation restrictions. And this is the lens through which I have read, analyzed, and am speaking to you today about the Brothers Grimm fairy tales, as well as two examples of modern day fairy tales, A Court of Thorns and Roses and Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies. And we will be talking about how all of these sources use disability. This means that I include characters who are turned into animals or turned into stone or anything like that, or anything non-human within the scope of disability here because it hits all of the definitional requirements. So I chose the phrasing use disability there quite intentionally because oftentimes disability is indeed used as something called narrative prosthesis. And this is a term that was originally coined by disability studies researchers David T. Mitchell and Sharon L. Snyder. Narrative prosthesis refers to when a disability or the disabled body is inserted into a narrative as a metaphorical or thematic opportunity first and foremost. So what this means is that the disabled body or the disabled character is exploited as a storytelling device first and foremost, rather than being like a whole character on their own. So in my collection of Grimm's Tales, it features 101 stories in total, and it is actually teeming with disability and disability metaphors and analogs and implications and narrative shifts, more so than I think the average person is probably aware of while they read. And yet there is very little commentary on or around it within the stories or outside of the stories in discourse, though as you might have noticed today, it is a wonderfully growing body of scholarship, which is very, very exciting. So disability shows up in the Grimm's fairy tales through three very distinct narratives. First is death, meaning the character with a disability or impairment or difference is dead by the end. Dreadful, meaning that the disability, impairment, or difference is presented as terrible, bad, or undesirable, either as a fate or a state to be in. And lastly, dangerous. So this means the character with a disability or a difference is an antagonistic force of some kind. So for a couple of Brothers Grimm examples, we have Cinderella, where doves poke out the stepsisters' eyes as punishment for their wrongdoings. Hansel and Gretel has a witch who uses crutches and has very impaired eyesight, who is killed in her own oven through being having her poor eyesight exploited. Then we have the Prince and Rapunzel, who throws himself from a tower and is blinded by thorns, but is later cured by Rapunzel's tears. And then we have Hans my Hedgehog, who was born half human, half hedgehog, and as a result of his physical differences is scorned by his father. So in my collection of 101 fairy tales, only 48 stories include absolutely no disability or disability analog or metaphor at all, which means the majority, 53 out of 101, do include disability in some way. Unfortunately, 35 of the 53 depict disability in a way that says that it's a dreadful fate or state to be in. And then most of them were, if those disabilities were not cured, it meant that the disabled person would die. And if they weren't already disabled at the start of the story, people would end up disabled as punishment for doing evil. So as an example, the same sort of narratives can be seen in many modern books today that can be considered, the descendants of some of these tales. So for example, A Court of Thorns and Roses is inspired by Beauty and the Beast and the Legend of Tam Lin. And in this book, the heroine's father is or has been beaten and now has a disabled leg and very impaired mobility, as well as chronic pain and trauma that severely impacts his mental health. However, similarly to many of the Grimm's tales, disability is first and foremost a tool for communicating tragedy, to distinguish or delineate his character, And the disability is kind of framed as a personal failing of some kind. So the father's inability to care for his children in the way that they want or need is not only seen as a personal failing, but as laziness. And his disability is also heavily doubted throughout the text by most of the characters in the book, including the perspective character. It is also a really, really dreadful tragedy later in the book when a fairy comes to the summer court with their wings cut off. They die, and then the non-disabled characters get to use that terrible event to see each other with more understanding and ultimately progress their romantic arc.
Ang ganda nga,
In
may
later books
design
in
din
this
ka
series
bakit
as well,
ano?
disabling injuries are completely healed, and the heroine's father completely overcomes his sort of disabilities and impairments and limitations to help at just the right moment of a climactic battle before ultimately, sadly, dying. So ultimately, this consistent depiction of disability creates a world in which disability exists as narrative prosthesis first and foremost. Some more Grimm's Tales examples include the 12 Brothers, in which 12 brothers are turned into swans and their sister must remain, quote, mute and dumb for several years if she wants to save them. Then in the Seven Ravens, similarly, brothers are turned into ravens and the sister has to at some point cut off a finger to unlock a door which will save them. In the story, The Three Little Men in the Wood, a good queen is turned into a duck, and then her one-eyed, ugly as night stepsister is implied to have been drowned for her evil doing. Another contemporaneous example is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies, which was published in 2023. In this book, the protagonist, Emily, writes down some fairy tales or folklore that she has heard or studied that feature explicit or implied disabled characters who are mistreated and or described as ugly due to having what can be read as a deformity. But there is no commentary or acknowledgement of this sort of theme or presence of disability in that text. So disability then also shows up in a character whose role in the story is to show how, quote, uncanny and abhorrent someone might act when they are, quote, broken by the fae, reduced to, quote, a puppet on strings. So again, not dissimilar to many of the Grimm's tales or depictions of disability. It feels like disability and disabled characters are being used to, for example, show how dangerous the world is, rather than being included as real people with like fully fleshed out experiences, wants, needs, etc. So in summary, the dead, dreadful, dangerous narratives persist. Disabled characters die, they overcome their disabilities, or they are villains, making them dead, dreadful, dangerous. They lack agency, they lack quality of life, or they lack morals. They are, again, dead, dreadful, dangerous. But what are the impacts of such persistent and pervasive disability narratives? For me personally, it resulted in something I've been calling self-erasure. So what that means is when I first started to try and write seriously, I didn't even consider that someone like me who is multiply disabled could be a protagonist of a story, let alone someone who isn't a villain or someone who ends up dead, which I think is quite sad. I have also another impact is that I have received the medical advice to push myself and essentially try to overcome my symptoms and limitations, which has sadly led to further disablement and pain. I have also had to correct people, including medical professionals, about their ideas or assumptions surrounding disability or my disability specifically. And then in questioning them, they have told me that they learned this incorrect information from movies and TV shows and books, which is frankly terrifying if we think about it. So those are just a few examples of the impacts of these prevailing narratives. There is also another prevailing idea that disability shouldn't or can't exist in fantasy because why wouldn't the disabled person just be cured if there's magic? And this is fundamentally ableist and false, but unfortunately the fairy tale genre does tend to reinforce this system of what is called compulsory able-bodiedness. So what that is for non-disabled people, disabled people should embody a yes answer to the question, but in the end, wouldn't you rather be like me? But I say disabled people and disability in general should not be more unrealistic than dragons, and disability should not need to be more justified in a text than the existence of the devil, for example. Moving on. The publishing industry has a lot of work to do when it comes to choosing which stories to pick up, pay for, and market. So, for example, as a writer, I have had a dozen short fiction pieces and critical essays published, and this was before I began mindfully committing myself to writing stories that feature, focus, or center disability in some way. And since then, unfortunately, my rejections have increased by over double. Now that I center disability in my work, there is apparently less willingness to pick it up, less willingness to engage with it and pay for it, unless the market that I submit to is actively prioritizing work about disability. So the personalized feedback that I and many other disabled writers often get on stories that differ from the very common disability narratives is some variation of, your writing is amazing, but I just didn't quite get it, or your writing is great, but I couldn't quite connect. And to me, what this demonstrates is an empathy and an understanding gap. So by perpetuating tropes that associate disability with things like villainy, punishment, or misfortune, writers unfortunately are reinforcing ableist ideology and are complicit, whether it's inadvertently or not, in the continued marginalization and misunderstanding of disability and disabled people. In a world where countries are far more willing to assist to fund assistive death, for example, before they will fund someone's wheelchair, in a world that tells disabled people to just stay home before considering making spaces accessible, and in a world where the majority of stories show disabled people as lacking in value or being unworthy of humanity or unworthy of even existing, both disabled and non-disabled people are, of course, going to internalize harmful ideas of disability. And this is why it is so important for readers to see disabled and chronically ill characters and narratives that do not confine them to stereotypical and ableist roles. Another reason is, just personally speaking, I would really love to see people like me in stories sometime. So to challenge some of the long accepted narratives, I would like to posit some ideas here for you today that might help equip you with a better understanding of ways that you specifically can contribute to and advocate for a more inclusive and equitable literary landscape. Let's start from a few of my favorite recent reads. A disabled character who exists outside of these ableist and limited roles would be well-rounded. They would have wants, needs, desires, and experiences that make them feel real, just like any other character. What if you had a multiplicity of disabled characters in your story? So the pattern of disability is diverse, as we see in Half a Soul by Olivia Atwater. Rather than being relegated to the role of a villain who is evil and disabled, as we see in Hansel and Gretel, what if they were complex, as we see in Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse? What if the disabled character were a competent, skilled person with an identity that goes beyond just their disability, as we see in Catherine Arden's The Warm Hands of Ghosts? What if, instead of disability being a tragic, dreadful thing, it was just a normal part of aging, as we see in T. Kingfisher's A Sorceress Comes to Call? What if disability and accommodations were a normal, everyday part of life, as we see in Show Me a Sign by Anne-Claire Lizotte? Another tip I have is that two questions I like to ask myself when reading or consuming media and writing anything of my own is, what pattern or message is being suggested here and why? And then the second question is there any way someone could take away a harmful message from this depiction? Next, I of course really recommend reading works by disabled and chronically ill creatives and showing the publishing industry that there is indeed a market for these stories. I recommend paying attention to people with disabilities and chronic illnesses and listening to what they're advocating for and why. Ultimately, the tip here is to try and do the work to bridge that empathy and understanding gap that I mentioned earlier. Lastly, my tip is to be vulnerable, be open-minded. We have to be brave sometimes and ask people to sensitivity read our work. It means trying and it means messing up. We are all tasked, unfortunately, with unlearning the narratives that we have been conditioned to accept. And inevitably, you are going to make mistakes, you are going to mess up, but I don't think that's a reason to not try writing disabled characters and disabled stories. I think that our dissatisfaction with the narratives that we have and our ability to imagine wonderful alternatives to harmful ableist narratives is a radical and a very powerful act. So I would encourage everybody to try, and I wish you all luck. And I will leave you with the closing sentiment that is, imagine how we could change this world by imagining more accessible, compassionate, and inclusive stories. That concludes my presentation, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate you. Good luck, and keep me updated on all of your amazing, amazing writing things. Thank you so much.
Oh, how I wish Ella were here for us to actually ask her questions. Really, really, what a wonderful presentation. So we'll collect questions for Ella and we will feed them through to her. And well done, Beth, for managing all of
Yeah.
that. Really,
Sorry
wow.
about my excessive mouse. I was trying to turn my video off and I struggled clearly. So sorry. Thanks for your patience with that.
No problem. Well, we're going to move straight on to Soraya Haddad. I'm so fascinated by this title. Can I even pronounce it? I'm a speech therapist, so this is a challenge for me, Soraya. The An-Architectural Witch. I hope I've got all of those pronunciations correct, and I'm going to hand over to you, Soraya.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Soraya. I'm a fourth year PhD, hoping to finish my PhD in the next few months. And just to give you a bit of context, so I'm coming at this more from a place of I'm focusing specifically my PhD on queer theory, but in the early modern period, looking particularly at characters deemed magical and what it is about their magical abilities that renders them queer creatures or queer bodies. So I have 3 chapters, each divided in 2 sections. So my final chapter's on fairies, my looking at Midsummer Night's Dream and The Tempest. My second chapter is on ghosts, so I look at Macbeth and a lesser known play called Friar Bacon and Friar Bungie. And then my first chapter, which is the one I'm going to talk a bit about today, is on witches. And I'm going to talk about the first play I look at in this chapter, which is called The Witch of Edmonton. So I'm just going to share my screen. And then just as I'm sharing my screen, I'll just say, I'm hoping to kind of go back in time a bit so we can then go forward in time to the Grimm brothers in Hansel and Gretel and kind of have a bit more of a background on maybe how some of these early modern stereotypes that we were seeing are still present, essentially. So right, hopefully you can all see that okay. Oh no, I've flipped ahead. You know what? That's fine anyway, because that's the oh, bear with. Okay, right. I'll get going. And hopefully it will stop changing the slides without me clicking them. Okay. So, I'm going to start off by explaining as quickly as I can what an architecture is, which is fundamental to my research. And as I will show, I think there's something to be said about this when we think about the witch's house and Hansel and Gretel. So, officially born in the 1970s, an architecture marks a coalescence between architecture and anarchy. While the former denotes a process of building, the latter marks an absence of order or control, disorder, confusion. An architecture is quasi-oxymoronic, synthesizing construction with deconstruction. As Gloria Moore explains, it is against established limits, thriving on the edges, in the margins, on the curbs, and in the gutters. While the former depicts, so architecture, depicts the act of construction, an architecture depicts the act of deconstruction. So I'm thinking about deconstructing normative buildings, but off of that, bodies and also normative thoughts. For seminal and architect Gordon Matta Clark, the artistic act of resistance marks a crossroad in travel. It's characterized by liminality, thriving on the destruction of socially imposed binaries. As was also the case in early modern England, societal norms encourage us to perceive every part of a structure as having an assigned normative place, a designated way of being. And architecture resists this by going beyond the boundary lines. And I'm just going to quote from Jack Halberstam, who talks particularly about the queerness of an architecture. So he writes that an architecture chases disorientation, cultivates vertigo, and tilts the opposition between building and ruin on its axis, such that the body itself is no longer available to simple binary inscriptions. Instead, like the destroyed building, the body becomes a leaky vessel, a shattered surface, a mess of entrails, a discontinuous circuit for fluids and electricity, ideas and desires. And just to say, the two images I picked here are works by Richard Greaves, who is a Canadian and architect who designed these. And I believe it was the 1980s when these were designed. So yeah, please keep these images in mind. This is just an example of some Anne architecture by Gordon Matter Clark. I suggest giving him a Google. I think his work is absolutely fascinating. Okay, so I'm just going to talk a bit now about Anne architecture and queer theory. So this paper employs queer as a kaleidoscopic term, building upon Madhavi Menon's productively deconstructive observation that defining queerness is an act which makes it no longer queer. As Lee Edelman puts it, queerness can never define an identity, it can only ever disturb one. While queer theory encompasses sexualities and gender identities deemed deviant to a society's normative status quo, its inherent resistance to categorization means the capacious theoretical framework expands to a wider disturbance of the times, spaces, and directions which a community is organized around. As Ahmed writes, the disorientation is embedded within queerness's anatomy, with the word itself etymologically stemming from the Latin torquere, which means to twist. In order to twist, one must break the mold of established bodily or psychological limits, and therefore transcend the shape assigned to them by the governing body, which decides what is the normative shape. Ironically, such twisting is not a metamorphosis, but an embracing of the natural shape societal norms attempt to reshape through social policing. As Dan Jones explains, queer theory seeks a new way of analyzing a culture built around straight expectations. So just a quick note on crip theory, and I know some of you may well be familiar with this term. So my research focuses on queer theory, as you can see. But I also, for this chapter, bring in crip theory, a branch of disability studies focused on an epistemology which draws attention to what the policing of bodies that do not fit into what Robert McRuer calls the heterosexual able-bodied mold. Crip theory puts the practices of othering inherent in the maintenance of compulsory able-bodiness in the spotlight, critiquing the disabled, non-disabled binary that deems disability abnormal in the process. Okay, so I want to go back now to early modern England for a little bit to get us forward to the Brothers Grimm. So I want to talk a bit about the Anne architecture of the human body. So one of the things I keep finding in my research is that there's so much early modern, particularly religious tracts, that are absolutely obsessed with describing, and a lot of this does come from the Bible, describing the body itself as a building and the idea, or as a home. And the idea that they're really trying to stress is if your body is deemed in what would be quite an ableist perception as not fitting the model of the home that it should, if it's deemed to have something about it that would be perceived as incorrect placement or broken or what they would have called monstrous. If your body is in that category, they would often describe it as like a broken house or a broken building. And what I'm kind of arguing throughout my PhD, and I'm also arguing here, is that it's because they were obsessed at the time with the house and the home as the microcosm of the Commonwealth. So if your body or your home, which they saw as interconnected, were deemed broken, you threatened infecting the Commonwealth, and all of the houses that make up the entire nation would fall. So that was this idea they were really kind of obsessed with, using metaphorically. So this first quote I've got is from Michael Schoenfeld, who says, while our post-Cartesian ontology imagines psychological inwardness and physiological materialism as necessarily separate realms of existence, humoral theory demanded the invasion of social and psychological realms by biological and environmental processes. And then I've got this quote from William Cowper, who was writing in the early 1600s. So he wrote, for as artificers out of an inordinate heap of things amassed together do raise up most pleasant buildings, making them by line and measure one of them proportional and answerable to another, so that now they make up a comely house, where before they were a disordered mass. So is it with the body of man, which of a confused lump of clay without form, God hath builded up in this pleasant form and comely order wherein now it stands. And as I say, this sort of lexicon was used so much we see it in many sermons as well at the time. So yeah, this was really bringing in humoral theory pre-Descartes, this idea that the body and the mind are fluid and connected. And this, as I hope to show, fed into a lot of ableism, because it meant that if they perceived your body as having something wrong with it or having some sort of disability, they would often take that as a signifier of sin in the mind. And see you as someone, almost to quote what Ella was saying, that either needs to be cured or purged and erased from society so they can't infect others. Thinking as well, this was of course a time when plague was rife, so that also very much fed into these narratives. So on the witch, so the stereotypical early modern witch is a prime example of a being who crosses the lines, contours, and measurements physiologically and psychologically expected of individuals within society. The witch explodes normative boundaries, borders, and compositions. As such, the witch is culturally posited as uncannily human and non-human, built on binaries which bulldoze the normative shapes within a society. The word queer is in many ways a relative of the word witch. As Kevin Talma Whitner Jr. notes, the witch is an exemplary figure of queerness. Likewise, Sasha Coward aptly observes the witch and the queer person are married in belief and folklore. And so I also quoted from Dan Jones here, who writes a brilliant book all about villains in history, and in film and television, etc. And he does say that often the villain, as is often said about characters such as Ursula in the Disney Little Mermaid, they're often seen to, or Captain Hook, that often seem to be very queer coded, painting the picture that the queer person is a threat to society. This image, just to say I've attached here, connects with the next image on this page. As you can see, witches are overwhelmingly stereotypically presented in this time period, as I think we've seen throughout history, as having disabilities, often because they are older and so you're more likely to, but sometimes they are younger and there's still that perception. But regardless of that, there's a clear connection here with this humoral idea that if the body is deemed disabled, the mind must be sinful, which is of course a horribly ableist notion that I can't imagine how that must have affected so many in the time. So the anarchitectural witch in Western folklore. So this is from Reginald Scott's Discovery of Witchcraft. He says, those typically suspected of witchcraft were old women, lame, blear-eyed, pale, foul, and full of wrinkles, which I think reminds us of the way the witch is described in Hansel and Gretel. Richard Sibbs wrote, a fair face and a crooked body, comely upper parts and the lower parts uncomely, suit not well, because comeliness stands in oneness, in a fit agreement of many parts to one. When there is the head of a man and the body of a beast, it is a monster in nature. So again, we can see the ableism here. So I write about this play called The Witch of Edmonton. And just to give you a bit of context, so in this play, Elizabeth Sawyer, who you can see here in this the first page of the quarto edition of the play from 1621. She is branded a witch by her society, and she says in the play, "And why on me? Why should the envious world throw all their scandalous malice upon me? Because I am poor, deformed, and ignorant, and like a bow buckled and bent together." So her own description of why she's deemed a witch is because in part of the way her body is perceived as disabled. And they see that as a signifier of her mind, therefore being an indicator of sin and a pact with the devil. She at one point describes her body as this ruined cottage, which reminds me so much of the Richard Greaves and architecture that I showed very early on in this talk. Just to say as well, just to give another example, at one point, one of the characters says, "Let her curse the other eye out," which shows that connection between sin and body. So the idea is she's already missing an eye. The more she curses, then it's going to cause the other eye to also kind of break. And again, I think it feeds into this idea of the broken building. Speaking of which, counter magical and architecture. So in the play, as I'll explain here, so this Elizabeth Sawyer was a real woman who was accused of witchcraft and unfortunately hung for it. So Henry Goodcull wrote that talking of her trial, that there was an old ridiculous custom that was enacted in which thatch was plucked from the house of a suspected witch and set on fire. The burning of the thatch of the suspected party's house is thought to be able to cure the party bewitched and to make the witch to bewray herself. And we've also got here a handful of thatch plucked off a hovel of hers, and they say, "When 'tis burning, if she be a witch, she'll come running in." So that third quote I just read is from the play, and the second one is another person at the time writing about this custom. So what this suggests is they believed that there was a direct stimuli between the body and the home, that if the home's on fire, the body will kind of miraculously respond, suggesting this kind of bizarre occult symbiosis between them, further showing that connection between the house and the body. Because of course witches are so historically associated with the domestic when we think of cauldrons, broomsticks, etc. Okay, so before I finish, how does this all relate to Hansel and Gretel? I started thinking about the cottage in Hansel and Gretel. So I'm just going to read this quote from the original Grimm Brothers version. So we've got, "When they approached the little house, they saw that it was built of bread and covered with cakes, but that the windows were of clear sugar. 'We will set to work on that,' said Hansel, 'and have a good meal. I will eat a bit of the roof, and you, Gretel, can eat some of the window. It will taste sweet.' Hansel reached up above and broke off a little of the roof to try how it tasted, and Gretel leant against the window and nibbled at the panes. Hansel, who liked the taste of the roof, tore down a great piece of it, and Gretel pushed out the whole of one round window pane, sat down and enjoyed herself with it." So they are lured in by an act of an architecture. And I wonder if symbolically there's something to be said again about this idea that it represents the downfall of society, or a forewarning against the downfall of society, warning children to be careful, not to get lost in the woods, and not to talk to old ladies deemed strange. And as we know, I won't read all of this because I'm conscious of time, but this quote kind of shows us the ableism used that I think Ella touched on as well when we hear about the witch. I have included some images of her to kind of demonstrate that, I mean, there's so many that depict her in an ableist way. So I think my concluding thing I want to say, so I want to conclude with a question by Jack Halberstam. So he asks, "If the human form can be depicted as a house, what does it mean to dismantle it?" And I finally wanted to do a little bit of etymology discussion. So something I was really interested in my writing of my chapter on the Witch of Edmonton and another play called The Late Lancashire Witches, also based on a real witch trial, is that we of course call witches historically hags. That's been a word. Hagging is, as we've got here, noun 1, the practice of witchcraft. Noun 2, it's cutting, chopping, or hewing with rough or heavy blows. And it got me thinking as well about Hansel and Gretel's father is a woodcutter. And I don't know, maybe I'm overthinking this, but I do think there's something in this with this fear of the witch tearing down society and the word hag. Anyway, I will stop because I'm very conscious of time. But yeah, thank you so much, and I welcome any questions. And finally, before I forget, this is my list of references, which should be on the Google Drive that I know Beth and Nicola put together. But if not, you can email me as well. So yeah, thank you so much.
Wow, that's just so fascinating, and it's just bringing up so many ideas in my head. I mean, yeah, Baba Yaga's house, I really hope we'll be able to pick up on that, because but also that's terribly painful to know that yeah, these plays were based on real events. So thank you so much, Soraya. We'll move on straight on to our final presentation by Raymond Rugg, who is going to take us, move us into the classroom and how the actual practice of how we can use some of these stories in ways of confronting stigma and raising, I suppose, children's, hesitate to use the term raising awareness because it feels a bit patronizing these days, but just bring bring these issues into lively classroom debate. Raymond, are you with us?
I am.
Splendid. And here you are. Wonderful.
Hello.
Hey, lovely to have you with us.
Oh, thank you.
To finish our symposium for today with your work, which I hope you're going to introduce yourself and say a little bit about what you do, as well as getting on to your really, really interesting practice-focused presentation.
Oh, thank you. Let me see, if I do this. Does that give you my, okay, perfect.
It does, yeah. So if you go to play slideshow rather than the, whatever it is, you know, the kind of one where you're working on it.
Right.
So
Yeah.
if you go
Oh,
up
it's blocking me. Let's see.
so it should be where you go up there to slideshow, you should be able to.
My screen has blocked me from getting it, so let me unshare for a moment.
If you start it in slideshow mode, that should work, I think.
All right, I think that. I'm so sorry. I am
No, please don't worry.
technical at this.
We're all tremendously familiar with technical glitches.
All right. Does that look right?
Yeah, perfect.
All right. So
Perfect. Thank you so much.
my presentation today is Carnival Mirrors in the Classroom, Addressing Disability in Fairy Tales. This is coming at the issue, looking at it from an elementary school teacher with teaching English language arts and compiling a classroom library for students. So a little about myself. I have a master's in education from Bridgewater State University here in Massachusetts, and I am currently studying for my educational specialist degree in reading and licensure as a literacy coach for the schools, and I currently teach 6th grade at a middle school here in Massachusetts. I teach English language arts and world history. And so where the the title of this comes from is that Carnival Mirrors in the Classroom is from Rudine Sims Bishop's observations in 1990 that in which she analogized books to windows and sliding glass doors. She described them as panes of glass that let students see through them and into other people's experiences and other people's worlds. Then she went on to describe how these sliding glass doors and windows can also, a pane of glass can also serve as a mirror, and that students not only can see other people's lives through this glass, but they can see their own lives reflected in this glass. And it gives validation, it gives affirmation. We've seen now in education and in the publishing industry as a whole that representation matters in books for children when they can see themselves in the stories. And so it's very much a trend in current education at my level that reading is self-affirming when students can see themselves in the stories. But the problem is that in so many of the classic children's literature, and not just classic children's literature, but all media, students with disabilities, when they see themselves reflected in these stories, it is not a positive reflection. It is so often students with disabilities see people with disabilities in these stories as being the bad people, the people who look like them, who are like them, because it's a punishment, not because it's how people are. And so that's the title of this comes from. It's instead of just a mirror, it's a warped mirror. It's a distorted image, like one might see in a carnival or a funhouse mirror, a distorted reflection. And I thought it was very apt and ironic that this is much the same way that the magic mirror in Hans Christian Andersen's The Snow Queen acts. It distorts reflections to make things look bad, to make them look ugly. And so I thought it was very interesting that dealing with representation of disability in fairy tales, there was actually a fairy tale to refer back to. And to relate to the looking at these stories, or how these stories present looking at disability through the lens of the philosophy, that one's physical appearance or abilities are representative of a person's intrinsic worth. So, as I said, this is focusing on elementary school level, in my case, upper elementary school level, and the classroom environment, the classroom libraries that we compile, and making these stories, particularly in this case, fairy tales, available to these students, presenting them that in a way they can be accessed and enjoyed by all the students. And it's, there have, in my conversations with other educators, at times the idea comes up, well, then we shouldn't, if this happens in fairy tales, these fairy tales shouldn't be made available. And it's the argument, counter argument is that it's part of the cultural heritage, a part of society's cultural literacy. Students, if they are not exposed to any of these fairy tales, they will not be able to grasp literary references when they're reading adult literature, when they're reading their high school literature. So they have to be able to be familiar with this body of work, but have to be able to access it without it making them internalizing a message that to have a disability indicates something bad or undesirable about a person's character. So this presentation particularly touches upon a number of educational practices that the classroom teacher can implement in order to address this, to allow students with disabilities and without disabilities to enjoy the fairy tales. What we did was I put a call out to all of my spheres in this area And then collected and compiled suggestions, ideas, had discussions about it, a survey of literacy education professionals in this area. And so, in particular, the head of this was my professor at Bridgewater State University, Dr. Marlene Correa, and also the instructional coach at the school where I teach, Tiara Dowd. So this is not by any means a definitive list. It may not even be a great list. It's in a way, it's a list of educational practices by committee, but at the very least, it gives ideas for educators to keep in mind in the classroom. The first one is critical literacy. Just teaching our students to read through the lens of critical literacy during and after reading fairy tales, prompting the students to discuss how these characters are being portrayed, characters with disabilities, supporting them in asking questions such as who is telling the story, whose voice is being heard when the story is being told, what is the end game? What is the point of this story? Is it a morality story to teach children to be good? Is it to show a triumph of good over evil? And what angle are they taking on that? Working with students, asking them questions, how does the disability affect how they're treated? What might the story be saying about differences in society? Or not only that, not what the story might be saying about differences in society, but what might it not be saying and what we can take away from what is not being said. We can work with our students for inclusive rewriting or adaptation. We can, as we read, what I do sometimes is read through once and then ask the students to reread it. If they have, say, photocopies or they have a digital format where they can actually physically block out descriptions of the character's physical appearances and abilities and disabilities. And then in many cases, they can see that these disabilities are not part of the plot. They're just simply a character marker, a shorthand for the storyteller to give us a signal that, well, if this person is described as ugly, they are an antagonist. The handsome prince is a protagonist, things along those lines. We also can have the students rewrite fairy tales with different emphasis. Have a character with a disability shown in a more positive or empowered light, which is and as we've seen in discussion here today, which is fantastic discussion, rewriting of fairy tales is a time-honored tradition, both for children. Those in my classroom, retold fairy tales are a favorite. For adults, fractured fairy tales. So we can rewrite the stories how we want to in my classroom. Curation of materials, avoiding harmful stereotypes. There are some stories from Grimm that I will not let into my classroom for my elementary school students at any point, not just for disabilities, but for other biases. One in particular, the Jew in the bramble bush. It's just not something that I feel my students are at a point where they can read. But a lot of them we can look at with my students. And so we focus on the parts that challenge stereotypes or as noted in some of the other points, where we can rewrite them or we can see what is being revealed by the society when we read them. Most of the rest of these are not specific to teaching fairy tales, but just about creating an inclusive environment in the classroom that carries over to when we are doing our literacy studies, such as using person-first language, having lessons on empathy, teaching students to consider how a character's disability might affect their life and perspective, real-world discussions about how society treats individuals with disabilities. One of the pushes in my school district is it's something called social emotional instruction. And we work on that. We devote a half an hour a day, 3 days a week, to working with these students. My students are 11 and 12, so they're going through kind of a chaotic time anyway. And this is the kind of thing we work with them a lot on that. It's part of the reason behind it is to reduce conflict just in the school. And the school psychologist has reported that they are seeing positive benefits from it. So I haven't seen the numbers on it, but that's what it sounds like. It's moving in a good direction. Number 5, promote universal design for learning, or UDL. Differentiate the learning materials, audio, tactile, visual aids. This is something that is very important to me because I find it incredibly hypocritical to make ability and disability respect a priority in my classroom and in theory, and then not follow through in practice. And I'm afraid that this is what happens a lot. A lot of the teachers that go through the education system here get this training and then kind of tuck it away in the back of their mind and don't really bring it into practice in the classroom. We also do a lot of collaborative group work. We do one-on-one with students talking and turning, and we do small group and large group where peer assessment and peer support provides scaffolding for the students when we read these materials. Incorporate disability respect, introduce disability history and culture, invite guest speakers, or create awareness activities. I have a visual impairment, and I bring this into the classroom with my students. Just empirically, I find that other students, that students with some visual impairments, it helps to put them at ease, and it helps them to share their stories when I am absolutely open about it. It also helps my other students understand that not all disabilities are visible, and hopefully I emphasize stopping and thinking about the fact that you don't see all disabilities, and you don't know what's going on with the students, with other students, just because you are in class with them every day. Finally, foster an inclusive classroom culture, celebrate differences, encourage self-reflection. Like I say, most of these final 3 or 4 slides are all about just the environment that you create in the classroom and could be condensed down, but a presentation by committee, this is what the teachers that I worked with came up with. And this encourage self-reflection, I do want to just note, helping students reflect on their own views about disability, encouraging them to consider how these views may have been shaped by the stories they've encountered. Just like in the earlier presentation, it is how many of my students, their only exposure or thinking about disability is what they see in the media. There's a popular comic book superhero who is blind, but all of his other senses are magically made superpowered. And so some of my students think that they think if they close their eyes, they put coverings over their eyes, their hearing is going to magically increase. And so these sort of things we confront in the classroom and we talk about, so that and I encourage them to actually not see disabilities of what they not just take what they see in the media as their perceptions of disabilities, but to talk with their classmates who are living the experience. That is it. I'm sorry I wasn't timing. I don't know if I went over, but that is what I have. It isn't, like I say, it isn't the end all be all, and it might not even be great, but it is a starting point for teachers to think about having the discussion and to consider what they're presenting in their classroom.
No, that was really, really fantastic. I think everybody would agree that you have to be quite brave, I think, to put down kind of guidelines, and I really commend you for doing that, because we need starting points. These are really difficult issues, and I think that presentation is enormously helpful,
No, thank you.
and is just a brilliant way of rounding off the day, because it gives us something to start with. So no, and you're well in time. So that's absolutely fantastic. Now if people have questions that they would like to direct to Ella, who is the first presentation this afternoon, if they can put them in the chat or send them to myself and Beth, we'll make sure she gets them. Might even be able to ask her some questions this evening, Beth, do you think? To report on tomorrow, possibly. Might be a bit optimistic. But meantime, we do have a couple of questions. No, we're making very good time indeed. So both Beth and I, when we were thinking in terms of the Anarchitectural Witch, immediately thought about Baba Yaga's house. And I don't know if Soraya, you could just say something about that, because that's the house that moves and jumps and is very much a kind of extension of the witch herself, I would think. I mean, I haven't looked into it, but it seems like a fascinating extension of what you were talking about.
Yes, absolutely. I will admit I did not know about this. So I did I saw you mentioned it in the chat box, and I did give a little Google image as well to kind of give me a bit of a visual. But yeah, I do think that that's really fascinating, and I think it further kind of shows that this was very much a trend going on at the time. Kind of it was beyond, I mean, I already kind of knew from what I'd looked at that it was beyond just England, but this further kind of for me is really helpful. So thank you for pointing it out, because I think it does show that kind of connection. I mean, as someone coming at this very ignorantly, as someone that does not know much about the story of Baba Yaga, I would say I think it does feed into that sense again, then, like you picked up on, of that an architectural kind of symbiosis between the human body and the body of the home, and the home is a reflection of the individual. And yeah, I'm so fascinated by the sense of the motion that the house is moving. I wonder if that further feeds into this sense of threat. From what I saw on Google, it said Baba Yaga is a figure that, I guess, like a lot of fairy tale characters, is presented in a multiplicity of ways. But I wonder if this does feed into the kind of more demonizing, nightmarish figure of the witch, to kind of encourage children to be careful when they're out alone. I don't know. I'm kind of guessing there from what I can see. But yeah, that's kind of what I'd say on that. But thank you so much for bringing it up, because that's definitely something that I can maybe look to as further evidence of this kind of bizarre connection going on with houses and witches and bodies.
Yeah, absolutely. I had another thought as well. Well, actually, if you'll bear with me before I get to the actual question put in the chat. So, this is a thought that I had also when I was listening to you speak, Raymond, which is that, sometimes I think that the way these stories are told goad the audience into empathy. And I had this thought when I was listening to, or I was telling actually, the story of Molly Whuppie. And there's the awful bit, which I left out in my telling for kids, of where, she's given hospitality, Molly Whuppie, by the giant's wife. But when the giant comes home, they go to bed, and he swaps the necklaces of gold that are around his children's necks with the necklaces of straw which are around the necks of Molly and her sisters, and that means that he cuts off his own children's heads. Now, I'm quite familiar, you get that in Jack the Giant Killer as well. And I've always found that totally horrifying, I mean, as a child. But it struck me when I was reconstructing the story to tell that that's exactly the reaction that the storyteller wants. The storyteller wants the audience to stand up and go, hang on, that's not fair. And I wondered if there was something there as well with the whole thing about Hansel and Gretel eating the witch's house. I mean, I think there's an ambiguity there, which is that on one way, you know, they're hungry and there's a kind of entitlement because she's a witch, so she's bad. But on the other, actually going and taking somebody's house apart and eating it is a, you know, that's an immoral thing to do. And so I often think in these stories there's a kind of ambiguity that can be really exploited in the telling. And I don't know what anybody else thinks about that, but I think it's useful in the classroom and with audiences to actually almost like pause the action and go, hang on a minute, what is going on here?
Yeah, I'll just really quickly say and then hand over to you, Raymond, if you wanted to. But yeah, I think that's such a good point. I think it is ambiguous, and I think it also depends partly on I guess which, again, to come back to the idea of it as kind of like a multiverse, which version of the fairy tale you're reading. Are you reading the Grimm brothers one? Are you reading a slightly different one? How's it translated? And I think it would be interesting to look at how there's some where the ambiguity is more pronounced, or there's some where it's less pronounced. But yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I can say from looking at the two plays I write on for my witchcraft chapter, The Witch of Edmonton, the one I discussed, you do feel which I think in many ways can be seen as, you know, it's heavily folkloric in the way the plays come about and her trial came about. It can be seen as a kind of quasi fairy tale in some parts. She has a lot of agency, Elizabeth Sawyer, the witch, and we do feel really sorry for her because we often hear her perspective. She's constantly complaining about how it's so unfair, how she is abused by her society and judged based off largely the way she looks and her socioeconomic circumstances. The second play I look at, which is based off the late Lancashire witch trials, which is the one that took place in, oh my gosh, 1634, not the one that was in 1612, which is more famous. But those witches don't have agency, and it's much harder to feel empathy for them. And I'd say that one's actually a lot less clear cut. So I guess that's a roundabout way of saying I think it's really interesting to think about how the writer's interpretation might allow room for that sense of pity. I mean, I think it's hard to not feel slightly sorry for someone that's been shoved into an oven and left to die. So I totally get what you're saying there. But yeah, that's what I'd say on that.
Thank you very much. Raymond, I don't know if you want to come back on that before we go on to a specific question for you.
As far as my students, if I can just get them to not say mean things out loud, that's a win at the 11 and 12-year-old level. So if it's pity or empathy or a sense of camaraderie, we're fighting the good fight with these kids.
Yeah, but that's where I think actually as you tell the story, actually stopping and going, you know, what's going on here? How are you, you know, is this fair? Is this right? Is I found is a very positive way of engaging with them. So we've got a question specifically for you, Raymond, which came up from Kirsty Stanley, saying, do you acknowledge the challenge with person first language in some communities? And she says that means in general you say person with cerebral palsy, person who's had a stroke, living with X condition. But as Rachel Baker pointed out, in respect of autism, sometimes some populations prefer identity first language, as in autistic person, deaf person. It's actually really difficult to navigate this as if you don't carry a label yourself, so you don't have any kind of authenticity in the discussion, I find. Any thoughts on that, Raymond?
I actually, I think that's a fantastic point. And I think that's part of what this getting together with these teachers on this is that didn't come up until a different I was doing this presentation to some of the other educators, and this point came up. And I think it's a great point to show that the disabled community is not a monolith that everybody, you know, that you can pigeonhole. It's people, and all people are going to have different preferences. People are different people, different groups. I think it's a really good point, and I think it really also points out to these educators that, you know, there isn't just, you just can't have a personal development day of training at school and, oh, all of a sudden you're going to be an expert in how to handle the disabled issues in your classroom. It is, and as you mentioned, just it's so hard to wrap around all the issues of it. And so I think that is just almost the perfect example of how you can't just say, well, we've got it, we're done. We're done with this issue, and now we can move on. It's a living, breathing experience.
Yeah, thank you so much for reminding us of that. It's that ever-changing, keeping up with the flexibility and the changing landscape, but above all, listening to people. Shakira's got a lovely point about Baba Yaga here. The hut on hen's legs, a real type of granary building built on upended tree stumps. You see them here as well. We've got one just down the road, just outside Maiden Bradley. And in Japan, they have them as well, of course, to stop rats getting in. The tree stumps looking like hen's legs with roots at the top, and it's a Central European tradition. Apparently, local wandering wise women were welcome to climb up and sleep there at need. And a Czech friend sent some photos. Absolutely, yeah, it's absolutely fascinating how, so that brings us back to architecture again, doesn't it? And the whole kind of role of architectural buildings. I was thinking again in relation to Emma's story, you know, how the girl has to climb in the, I can't remember, I lose this, but she was saying, you know, the woman who has to break her finger to put on the rungs of the ladder to climb up to rescue in the it's a version of Beauty and the Beast. Then these again, you have these very, very vivid images of particular vernacular buildings, I think. Great. Now, are there any questions that I have omitted, Beth?
Yeah, there was one. There was one for Raymond. Did I unmute? Just checking. It says, Raymond, reference to visible disabilities is challenging.
Non-visible disabilities.
Non-visible disabilities. Can we think through an architecture of the witch via disability that is neurological rather than physical?
Ooh.
Just to check, is that for both of us?
Well, it began with Raymond, but
Yes.
both of you are more than welcome to answer. It'd be great to have both of your thoughts if you both have thoughts you'd like to share.
I would love to hear what you have to say, because I really don't have anything for it.
Okay, yeah. Oh, sorry, Nicola.
No, I'm just saying to Raymond, I don't believe you don't have anything for us. Carry on, Sarah.
I'll talk and then we'll see if maybe Raymond, yeah, I agree. I'm sure we'd love to hear. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think something I maybe skimmed over today just because of being conscious of timing, but I do talk more about in the chapter itself, is I do talk more about kind of what do I mean by disability. And I do discuss how there was a sense of, particularly in The Witch of Edmonton, more than my second play, again, because the witch in that play is a more rounded character compared to kind of just a prop of caricature. I do think there's more of a sense of something to consider about neurological disability. I mean, at this point, I'm also just, this is literally me just being very unacademic and just surmising. But I would say, while of course they didn't have language at the time for things like neurodivergence, I do wonder from the research I've done, if sometimes, let's say someone is not neurotypical, I think there is an argument for that could potentially put them at more risk of being accused of being a witch, because they're not seen to maybe follow the kind of norms of the society. So I do think there's a sense of that as well. And I think, again, off of that, it does also come back to this kind of idea that if there's something wrong with or deemed by them wrong with your, wrong in inverted commas, body, that would mean that your mind is also broken in some sort of way. So I think for the people of the time, they would have considered it as neurological in a way that the body and through humoral theory, the mind were fluid. But yeah, I don't know if that really answers the question, but it's so frustrating. We don't have enough to really, because they didn't have, of course, the vocab that we do today. But I do think there is definitely something that a lot of research, a lot more that maybe could be done on looking at neurological disability and those that were kind of more likely to be accused of witchcraft. So yeah, thank you. I will think about that, because that's a really, really great question.
Right. Anything else on that, Raymond?
I think maybe Rachel's comment that the fairy tale doesn't map as well onto neurodevelopmental disabilities. That may be, I just off the top of my head, that kind of rings true to me, is that we're seeing the physical disabilities or the physical representations, and maybe those have been translated, but I don't know. It's something I'd really have to think about. It's a fantastic issue.
So actually researching neurological disability and, well, neuroatypical disability in fairy tale is my niche research area. Okay, so if you look at nearly all cultures, you will have a representation of Jack, who quite clearly has the characteristics of somebody we would now call on the autism spectrum. So the classic story of this, which is brilliant because it also involves a deaf character, is Joseph Jacobs' Silly Jack. And we use this a lot with in open storytellers at the beginning, because what happens in Silly Jack is that Silly Jack goes out to get a job, and he comes home, he's given some money, he doesn't know what to do with it, he throws it up in the air, falls in the stream. So his mother says to him, "You stupid boy, next time put it in your pocket." And the next job he has is milking in the dairy, and he gets given a jug of milk, and he pours it in his pocket. And this kind of follows through to the very redemptive end, where he makes a deaf girl who has never laughed. He makes her laugh, and they fall in love and get married. Now, you find those in Japan. Japan is absolutely full of these stories, interestingly, but you find them all over Europe. And what is very interesting in telling that story, and it goes back to this point about the questions that are posed to the audience when the story is told, is that it is absolutely clear when you go through the story that your question is always, why is the mother not adapting what she tells him to her son's needs? And that kind of goes back to the question that we say, when you're looking at the difficulties that some people have in interpreting or understanding information, then the responsibility is on the interlocutor to adapt the way that they ask the question. And we use that really to great effect in workshops for social workers and caregivers, because it's really, really obvious in this story that this is somebody who follows instructions literally. And you also, of course, find changeling stories, masses and masses of changeling stories, which map onto the experience that parents very often share about what it is like to discover that your baby, who seemed to be developing normally, is developing atypically. So I would say that actually it's a question of looking and knowing what to look for in these fairy tales and legends, because I think all kinds of disabilities are there. Although interestingly, and this was something that I explored a bit in Australia and in Nova Scotia with Mi'kmaq people, but I mean, I haven't done this very widely. It seems that sort of earlier cultures, kind of hunter-gatherer cultures that were animistic, you don't find quite the same representations. It seems to be associated with a move towards a more settled society with more distinctive roles, but I haven't had the ability or the time to follow that through. Anyway, I'm so sorry for taking that back. Of course, if you will ask questions about neuroatypicality in fairy tales, I can't shut up. Yeah.
Just to add on a little bit, it's a slight tangent, but the link sort of came to me as you were all talking, in terms of, I guess, the disability. We're looking at, I guess, like neurodiversity, or like the Silly Jack story you were talking about, Nicola, and the idea that there can be merit in looking retrospectively at these stories and interpreting them in a way that they wouldn't have been able to at the time, but we can now because we have this understanding and this empathy. And I think it struck a chord with me, because that's honestly how I felt reading Red Riding Hood, because I also have a visual impairment, and sort of reflecting on that story, thinking I will walk a specific one route that I know I won't probably walk into something. It can still happen, but and why is Red Riding Hood's mother so insistent she take that one path through the woods? And why is her coat so bright and distinctive? I wore a red coat as a child, mostly so I was more visible, to rely on other people seeing me more than I'd need to rely on spotting them. And yeah, I think it's another aspect of what encompasses this whole symposium is there's such nuance in these stories that might not have been the original intention, but certainly we can make it our intention, and there are really rewarding things to come of that. So I've been really inspired hearing all of you talking. So thanks for that.
And if I can just say, this is fantastic, because I specifically, and the teachers I worked with, we were specifically looking at this at the antagonists. This is a great way to look at, to have mirrors, see yourself in these stories as the protagonist in a way that's affirming. So thank you. This is fantastic.
Right. So question, Beth, if you can type the name of what it is you were writing. Oh, storytelling, green spaces, and oh yeah, sorry, that's a message for me from David, which I started reading out, but I'm just going to reply to it privately saying, yeah. Beth, there was something you were going to typing a name of what you wrote.
If you mean my novel, I'm guessing.
Oh yes, your novel.
Yes,
We need to know your novel.
I've linked it. It's out the 27th of March. That's my Red Riding Hood retelling.
Fantastic.
Thank you for asking about that.
Right, guys, thanks to all of you, we have managed to finish dead on time, which is absolutely superb.
It's incredible. I've never been to an event that's done that online. So
this is because we've had such disciplined speakers and such wonderful audience. Just the right number of questions. Beth, if you want to just stay on the call, perhaps you and I can just talk briefly about tomorrow.
Yes, we can.
Okay, but meanwhile, goodbye everybody. Go and enjoy your cups of tea. Thank you to all our wonderful presenters. Thank you for the brilliant questions, and hope to see some of you tomorrow.
Yes, really hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you everybody for coming. It's been an absolute joy. Nicola, you probably stop recording also.